You for this day. We thank you that we can gather together to learn of our heritage as the Christian church, that we can learn more about how we understand you, how we worship you, and how you bring us the gift of salvation by studying. Be with us now as we continue to look and understand the Nicene Creed that we confess as your church. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, good morning. Welcome to our third session. Today, we're really going to get into the uh, what's going on in the church that gives birth to the Nicene Creed, and what are the issues and the importance of it. What we have seen, just to review for a few minutes, what we've seen in the first 300 years of Christianity, there was never a period with form of controversy or disagreement. Sometimes Christians think, oh, if we could just get back to that time of the early church when they all got along, we wouldn't need to have denominations. We could all think the same way and worship together. There was never that harmonious period. The church has always had contentions and some very serious disagreements. So the contentions did not start at the time of the Reformation in the 1500s. We've already seen that very early on. The Apostle Paul and James the Elder, the little brother of Jesus, they had significant disagreements. The issue was particularly under what conditions do we accept non-Jews into the church? And James, who's centered in Jerusalem, and his followers are saying, well, it's very simple. Gentiles need to convert to Judaism in order to be Christians. The males need to be circumcised. They need to follow the basic dietary laws. And Paul, who had previously persecuted the church because they weren't keeping the law as he thought they should, God called him to go to the Gentiles to proclaim the gospel, that you are accepted by God the same way that Jews are accepted, through faith in Jesus Christ. That was a huge point of contention. We saw in the middle of the 2nd century, Marcion, church history colors him as the first great heretic. Marcion, a Gnostic, is saying the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. And to this day, we still have some Marcionites around that want to dismiss or cut the Old Testament off from the New Testament. Also, remember, Marcion was saying Christ is not the same as Jesus. Christ is the eternal Spirit of God who inhabited the human body of this guy named Jesus of Nazareth to reveal God's true, or to reveal the true knowledge of salvation. But before Jesus was crucified, the human Jesus was crucified, Christ, the eternal Spirit, got the heck out of that body, because material things like bodies are bad. We also noted Montanus. Montanus and his followers are saying, we have the Holy Spirit. So therefore, we can reveal what God is really thinking, what God is all about. You all don't have the Holy Spirit. We do. And so the church had to deal with that. And then we had the Donatists. In the times of persecution, some Christians gave in. They gave in for whatever reason. They either renounced their faith, or they sacrificed to idols, or they gave over the sacred scriptures to avoid persecution. And then after the persecution, the issue was, can they come back into the church? And the Donatists were saying, no, no. Once you lapse, once you've given in, once you've not been completely faithful, you can't come back. So they were very, 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 very rigid. And then the Donatist controversy flipped on its head, because in various spots, like in Rome and Carthage, the church was saying, no, 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 no. We can welcome them back because God's mercy and love supersedes God's harsh judgment. But then the controversy became, okay, the Donatists, some of them were excommunicated. And then the issue was, well, if the Donatists were excommunicated because of their hard attitudes, what about the people they baptized? If they're excommunicated, then that baptism isn't any good. So we got to rebaptize. So then that became the whole new controversy. And in each of these cases, a central issue was authority. Who or what possesses the authority to ground and guide Christian faith, to ground and guide Christian doctrine? Now, for the non-sectarian churches, they had a three-pronged solution. And when I say non-sectarian, other historians will say the Orthodox churches. The sectarian churches said, we got true knowledge, screw the rest of you. But it's the churches that weren't sects, that were involved with each other. So their three-pronged solution with regard to authority. First, apostolic authority was large, particularly in the office of the bishop. For the first generation of Christians, authority was particularly lodged in the apostles, because they knew Jesus, or they had been called by Jesus. After they died, the office of bishop emerged as an authoritative office. There were bishops when the apostles were still alive, but it was a different type of office. So the office of bishop became teaching, doctrine, authority, also discipline authority. And over time, and not too long, you had the emergence of apostolic succession. You had the apostles, and they appointed the bishops, and then the bishops appoint bishops, and so on. So you had apostolic succession, and we still have that today. One of the, and mentioned this last week, one of the big controversies in the ELCA, before sex was a controversy, apostolic succession was a controversy. There's also, into the second, third, fourth century, it's the growing emergence of the New Testament canon. That becomes authority, the New Testament books, especially the four Gospels, Acts, and the 13 letters of Paul. Until the 4th century, Hebrews, James, Revelation. Some churches said, yeah, those books are authoritative. Other churches were going, not those books. It really wasn't until the late 300s and early 400s that you had the 27 books of the New Testament. That's the canon. Those are the books that are authoritative. But for Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, by the 2nd century, they're being collected and circulating together as authoritative for Christian faith, for Christian doctrine, for Christian life. And then the other authority was the Catholicity of the church. In other words, what's commonly taught and believed, that's authoritative doctrine and practice. We still want to recognize pockets of Christianity in the first centuries, but also the East and the West. So the circles of red are the churches in the East, Greece, Asia, modern-day Turkey, Syria, Alexandria. They were tighter with each other, and they're much more numerous. We got a lot more members than the churches in the West, the churches colored in purple. And the two main pockets of Christianity in the West, Rome and the churches associated with Rome in Italy, and Carthage, northern Africa. So Christianity, Catholicity, the universality of the church evolved. It doesn't just happen right away. It evolves over centuries. So now we want to jump to the early 300s and the rise of Emperor Constantine. Okay. By the year 311, Rome had 4 different emperors. Because Rome, the empire, was so expanded and had grown bureaucratically so complex that emperorship evolved, and they thought we got to have numerous emperors to rule certain areas. So by 311, Rome had 4 emperors, a guy named Licinius, another guy named Maximinus Dae, Constantine, and Maxentinus. If you got 4 emperors, you got 3 too many. And it's inevitable. What's going to happen? War. In the year 312, Constantine invaded Italy, and he faced off against Maxentius. Constantine was from farther east. Maxentius was the emperor over Italy, and Constantine wants power. So he takes his army, he invades Italy. And in October 312, Constantine defeated Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And Maxentius was killed in the battle. Now you might think, have to do with Nicene Creed. According to the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, the evening before the battle, Constantine had a vision. Now, this is according to Eusebius of Caesarea, who is a contemporary of Constantine. Other historians dispute this, but according to Eusebius of Caesarea, the evening before the battle, Constantine saw in the sky a cross. And according to Eusebius, Constantine heard a divine voice which said, "In this you shall conquer." So according to Eusebius, Constantine had a conversion experience, and that's why he won the battle. Now, in actuality, it may have been more the case that Constantine was trying to curry the favor and the support of the powerful Christian God for the upcoming battle. He might not have had a true conversion experience, and it would be inaccurate to say he became a Christian that night, but he did recognize that the Christian God was pretty darn powerful. And so the whole mindset, you go into battle, you want the most powerful God on your side because your God is fighting the gods of your opposition. But whatever the case, what is historical fact is before that battle at the Milvinia Bridge, Constantine, well, we go back a sec. Yeah, no, we'll do that. So Constantine's conversion to Christianity was a much longer process. In fact, we're going to see in a bit, he wasn't baptized till he was dying. So he wasn't baptized for over 2 decades. But after he won, it was he and Licinius were the 2 emperors. They ruled jointly. And a year after the battle, they jointly issues the Edict of Milan. And this changes everything. The Edict of Milan. Roman citizens throughout the empire are now free to worship as they pleased. And that included Christians. Religious freedom for Roman citizens. So for the first time, Christianity was to be tolerated because it's a state-sponsored religion. Previously, sometimes Christians were persecuted by the Romans, sometimes they weren't, but they were never recognized as a state-sponsored religion. So in 313, Christianity is declared to be legal. And that means it was illegal to persecute Christians. Christianity did not become the official religion of the empire until the year 380. But in 313, now the emperors are saying Christians are fine. Christians have the freedom to worship as they want. Okay, so now you have 2 emperors, Licinius and Constantine. But if you have 2 emperors, you have what? 1 emperor too many. By 324, Licinius was out. Constantine was the sole emperor. Again, Constantine depends on how you define someone as a Christian. Constantine refused to be baptized, but Constantine was very much favorable to the church. With the end of the civil wars, when Constantine is the last emperor standing, An era of relative peace and prosperity is being inaugurated under Constantine. So now the empire is entering a new phase with only one strong emperor. Constantine also sought a return to the empire's former glory. The empire you had at the end of the first century into the middle of the second century, you had the empire's golden age. You had the five great emperors who were really consolidating and building up the empire. That ended in the late second century. And then you had a series of stinky emperors. Okay. If you ever saw the movie Gladiator, okay, the last great emperor was Richard Harris, Marcus Aurelius, and then his son Commodus. It started going in the toilet. Constantine wants to return to the golden era of those emperors. And he concluded the best way that that can be accomplished is on the basis of Christianity as the unifying thread throughout the empire. Constantine recognized in the East, Christians are growing. They're pretty strong. But you also have Christians in Rome. You got Christians in the West. The church is spread across the empire. So he saw Christianity is that which can help unify the empire. So Constantine showered favors on the church. He showered favors on the church leaders. That resulted in a significant upswing in conversions to Christianity. Christianity is on the way to becoming the religion of the empire. Won't happen till 380. But think of this. If you're a fairly well-to-do Roman citizen, it doesn't matter whether you live in Spain or you live in Egypt or you live in Greece. If you're suddenly saying, the emperor favors Christians, I don't think I'm going to worship Jupiter anymore. It's in my best political interest to worship who? Jesus Christ. So suddenly Christianity is becoming popular. Before, the Romans looked at Christians as an atheistic threat. Now it's popular because the emperor likes the church. It's at this time too. Constantine's mother, woman named Helena, converts to Christianity because of her son. And Helena wants to know where all this Christian stuff happened. So she goes to the Holy Land. And her guide is Eusebius of Caesarea. And they did go to Jerusalem. Well, where was Jesus crucified? And the local church said, oh, it's right over there. Right over there is where he was crucified. Well, there happens to be a pagan temple there. Well, Helena says, we're going to build the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So tear down the pagan temple. Oh, we're going to go to Bethlehem. Oh, where was Jesus born? Oh, come here. It's right over there. So the holy sites in the Holy Land start coming now. Then in 324, Constantine announces God has directed him. God has directed him to build a new capital, a glorious capital for the empire. And it's going to be Constantinople. So in 324, Constantine says, okay, we've been in Rome for over 500 years. The Rome has been the center of the empire. No, we're going to go east. We're now going to make a new capital for the empire. And there was a city, wasn't a glorious city, but it was a city called Byzantium. And Constantine says, that is going to be my capital. And he just so happens, let's change the name. We're going to name it after me. So things are changing. Things are changing for the church. Things are changing for the entire empire. And just as Constantine was planning this huge move, we're shifting the center of the empire from Italy to Asia Minor. A major theological controversy was spreading in the church. And that controversy threatened the peace and unity of the church. Constantine is seeing the church as the key to the unity of the empire. But if the church is split, who's going to be impacted? The empire. See how now Christianity and the politics of empire are becoming totally intertwined, and it's going to be that way through the 20th century. So it's especially volatile in the East. But that's where Constantine wants to make the center of the empire. That's where the majority of the Christians live. So it's this church and empire are becoming intertwined. So disunity in the church suddenly threatens to result in the disunity of the empire. And when you fast forward 15th century, Martin Luther is threatening the disunity of the church or of the empire. And the answer is yes. So up to this point, we've seen there's theological controversies go all the way back to the early church. But up to this point, theological controversies were addressed by a local conference of bishops, not civil authorities. Okay, when you had Paul and James having a theological controversy, they didn't bring the Romans in. With Gnosticism and Marcion, they didn't bring the government in. They were solved by local bishops. And they were solved by internal theological debates, not civic authorities. But once you get this intertwining of church and empire, you can't separate them. So that civic authorities are going to get involved with church controversies. Again, fast forward 15th century. Martin Luther is called before the Diet of Worms. He's told he has to recant. You know who's sitting in the room when Martin Luther presents his case? For Charles V. Can't separate them. So with Constantine's strong attraction to Christianity, the situation is radically changed. The empire and the church are growing ever closer. So civic authority, ecclesiological authority are now intertwined. So Emperor Constantine decided to intervene in a theological church dispute. And so he calls a council of all the bishops, not local bishops, all the bishops, to meet in the city of Nicaea. That's not a coincidence. Nicaea is just 40 miles from the site of Constantine's new capital. In other words, Constantine says the meeting of the bishops is going to be on my turf. Okay. So Nicaea is in northwest Turkey, 40 miles from modern day Istanbul. So Constantine wants a lot of control here. Now, Constantine, though, he also says, I'll pay for you, bishops. I'll pay for you to come. I'll pay all your expenses when you stay here. So look at this. 20 years earlier, bishops and other leading Christians were being persecuted by the emperor and the emperor's minions. Now you got the emperor saying, come on, I'll pay for you to come. And we got to decide this. So, what is the major theological controversy? Controversy erupted in the church in Alexandria. Alexandria, Egypt, city founded by Alexander the Great back in the 4th century BCE. Alexandria was a major center of Christian thought in the East. Over the past few centuries, especially in the East, not the West, but in the East and in Alexandria, there was a fusion, a merging of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. It's coming out of Alexandria, where suddenly Christian theology was saying, we have an eternal soul. Forget this resurrection of the body stuff. The body is bad. That's Greek philosophy. That's not Bible at all. But this fusion was also influencing the views of a guy named Arius. Arius was an elder in the Alexandrian church. Arius was popular. He was very well respected. And to Arius, okay, so he's got Christian thought and Greek thought. To Arius, God is the immutable, unchangeable, completely supreme being. Okay, so God has to be completely separated from creation. Why? Creation changes. God can never change. Human beings are imperfect. God is perfect. So there's this huge gap between God and the created world, and human beings are part of the created world. Once you start with that as your basic theological understanding, what happens? God had to have a go-between. God can't create creation. God is perfect, can't change. Creation is imperfect and changes. So God had to create a go-between to create creation. And to Arius, that's right in the New Testament. So the go-between was the logos. Logos is a Greek word that means word. And Arius turns to John chapter 1. Look at John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. He, the Logos, was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And then John 1:14. And the Word, the Logos, became flesh. So Arius is thinking, okay, God can't create creation because God is so separate. God is so perfect. God is so unchangeable. So what God does is create a go-between, another divine figure to create creation. And of course, God can't become human because God is God. But the go-between can become human. So Arius reasoned the supreme being who's immortal and eternal created the word, created the logos, who is not immortal, who's not eternal. But God needed that divine agent who creates creation. And he's going right into the New Testament, says it's right there. It's right there. So the word or the logos subsequently became a mortal human being whose name was Jesus Christ. Do you see what Arius is saying? Jesus Christ is not eternal. Jesus Christ is a created divine being, not an eternal divine being. John. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. This is a this is being descriptive, not pejorative. Jehovah Witnesses are contemporary Arians. They deny the eternal reality of Jesus. So according to Jesus, or according to Arians, Jesus Christ is an inferior divine spirit. Okay? Jesus Christ was granted divine revelations to bring human beings uh, because as the Logos, Jesus was created by God. That means, according to Arius, Jesus is not part of God's essential being. Right? Jesus is created. Thus, for Arius, there are two divine beings: God, the superior divine being, and the Son, the inferior divine being. And his argument, Arius' argument, actually appealed to many of the recent pagan converts. Why? The pagan converts were used to multiple divine beings. So yeah, we can have superior gods and inferior gods. So Arius' view is starting to get popular. Arius is in Alexandria. The Bishop of Alexandria is a guy named Alexander. I know you got to have a scorecard. Who are all the players? Alexander vehemently disagreed with Arius. Now, Alexander was not the deep deep thinker that Arius was. And we'll tell you who his advisor was in a second. So to Bishop Alexander, the Logos, the Word, was co-eternal with God. The Word couldn't be created by God. Arius is completely wrong. Now, Bishop Alexander was greatly influenced by his secretary. His secretary was a deep thinker. His secretary was a deacon named Athanasius. And Athanasius concluded, you know what's at stake here? Not just Jesus Christ. Salvation was at stake. Why? Athanasius said, only God can save human beings. And if Jesus, the Word made flesh, wasn't fully God, then humans aren't saved. Okay? You can't be saved. We can't be saved by an inferior divine being. So for Athanasius, it wasn't just, okay, we got to debate about Jesus. We're debating our entire salvation. So the issue again is coming, who is God? Arius, as supreme being, God is completely other. And if God is completely other, or because God is completely other, God does not create. The Son, as the agent who creates, can't be of God's essence. So God can't become human. The Son can become human because the Son doesn't have this essence as God. And you have Alexander Athanasius, his advisor, says, look, core biblical theology. Core biblical theology, God is the creator through the agency of the Son. So Athanasius even goes back to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the world. Core biblical theology. The Son, who is fully God, became human in order to save humans. So Bishop Alexander charged Arius with denying the divinity of the Word and so denying the divinity of Jesus. This also means Arius is denying the church's worship. The church worships Jesus, but you can't worship a creature that was made by God. That's idolatry. So what's at stake is not simply Jesus. It's the church's core belief with regard to us as salvation, with regard to our worship. But Arius turned around and he charged Bishop Alexander with denying Christian monotheism. He says, you can't have two gods. So Jesus Christ can't be the same as God. So you have the bishop charging Arius and Arius charging the bishop. Arius is saying only God can be God, and therefore Jesus can't be God. Well, you got a controversy between a bishop and an elder. Who do you think's going to win that minor controversy? Yeah. So Bishop Alexander convened a conference of local bishops. They condemned Arius and his followers. But Arius is a really shrewd politician. So he appealed to his longtime friend, Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, not the same Eusebius that was the historian and a good friend of Constantine. So Arius goes to Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia. Oh my gosh, where's Nicomedia located? Halfway between Constantinople and Nicaea. Okay, so you see how everything's getting really intertwined. Now, through his primary ecclesiological ambassador, Constantine had a bishop from Spain advising him. Constantine appeals to Bishop Alexander, make peace with Arius, make peace with Bishop Eusebius. Why? Constantine wants unity. Unity in the church means unity in the empire. So Constantine, the emperor, is saying to Bishop Alexander, you got to make peace. But to Alexander, the stakes were too high. He refuses to compromise with Arius or his bishop to whom he appealed. So that's why Emperor Constantine uses his imperial power to summon all the bishops to meet in Nicaea in May of 325 to decide the matter. First time ever, we're going to have an ecumenical conference of bishops. Constantine's goal is the unity and harmony of both the church and his empire. In other words, Constantine probably could have gone either way. As long as the bishops all agree, we got unity and harmony, Constantine was cool with that. Constantine, again, not baptized, he presided over the council as the emperor. He didn't join the debate that ensued, but Constantine is sitting in the room and he's in charge. So the bishops from the east far outnumbered the bishops from the west. Why? Two reasons. One, the level of controversy. It was much more controversial in the east than it was in the west. But also, if you're a bishop living in Spain, to go all the way to Turkey, that's a long way to travel in 325. So a lot of the bishops in the west didn't bother to come because they were not bishops. Arius and Athanasius neither were allowed to speak. So Arius could not stand up and present his position. Athanasius could not stand up and present his position because they weren't bishops. Behind the scenes, they were advising bishops what to say, but they couldn't say anything. So in May of 325, at first the council was divided into three different groups. You had the Arians, and the Arians got to have a bishop to be their spokesperson. That was Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, the local bishop. The other group was Bishop Alexander and his supporters. But the other group, the large majority of bishops, either didn't understand or care. They were there because the emperor said, you got to come. And so they're going, now immediately, the Arians proposed a creed. And it was a creed that supported their views. And it was rejected. Now, this is the other Eusebius, not the Eusebius that's on Arius' side. Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea proposed a basic creed that had been used before the controversy. He said, we got to have a starting point. It didn't address the core debate because it was before the controversy, but it was a starting point. And then we can amend the creed. Now, here's the really tricky thing, and we'll close with this one. A key point of debate involved two similar Greek words as they applied to Jesus as the Logos. One word is homoiosis, which means of like being. In other words, Jesus is like or similar to the being of the Father. That was Arius's whole point. Jesus is a divine being, but he's an inferior divine being. The other Greek word, and look how close they are, homoousios, which means of the same being. Jesus is of the same being as the Father. And that's what Alexander and Athanasius are arguing. So is Jesus like God's being, like God's essence, but not quite there? Or is Jesus of the same being, of the same God stuff? In the end, the council decided on homoousios. Jesus is of the same being as the Father. In other words, Jesus' God stuff is the same as the Father's God stuff. And next week we'll go through the creed and we'll see where that's confessed in the creed. Also, though, the council declared that Jesus was begotten, not made. Okay? Begotten, not made. In other words, God did not create Jesus. Okay? God didn't create Jesus. God is of the same essence, the same substance, the same stuff. Jesus was begotten, not made. And let's see, we'll leave it there. Okay. So our last week, next week, and again, next week will be in Fellowship Hall. We're going to look at the final conclusions of the Nicene Creed, but then we're going to take the creed and break it down and see, okay, what are they finally declaring and why does it matter to us today? Okay. So thank you.